Imagine sitting very still in a glittering room, hands folded in your lap, while somewhere down a long corridor that smells of beeswax candles and cold stone, a king is deciding, without telling you, whether you still matter. You don't know it yet. You're just sitting. Outside, the night is enormous and quiet over the gardens, and somewhere a fountain is still running, the soft hush of water on stone, the only sound for miles. This is what it actually felt like, most nights, to be a royal mistress. Imagine waking before the sun is properly up. Your room is cold. Somewhere below, a kitchen fire is already crackling, and you can hear faintly the scrape of someone raking ash from a grate 2 floors down. You don't get to lie there long. There is a face to build today. Not metaphorically, literally. A face, a posture, a temperament. All of it constructed fresh, every single morning. The way another woman might build a fire. If you were Madame de Pompadour, mistress to King Louis XV of France. Your mornings began with your hairdresser, your dressers, the soft tug of stays being laced, and somewhere in the middle of all that fuss, an ambassador or two, waiting politely in the next room, hoping to catch a few private words with you before they ever reached the king at all. Your toilette, the long layered ritual of getting dressed, was attended by ambassadors and ministers, because everyone at court understood that the quickest road to the king ran straight through your dressing room. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Before you'd even had your morning chocolate, you were already at work. Not glamorous work, political work, logistical work, the work of being, every single day, indispensable. Here's the part almost nobody tells you about royal mistresses. The job was exhausting in a very literal, very physical sense. Keeping a melancholy king distracted from his own dark moods was, by every account, a full-time and exhausting occupation. There were late nights at the theater, dinners that ran on past midnight, long coach rides through the dark. And then you were expected to be up again early the next morning, ready for a full day of more of the same. Picture that for a second. You finally climb into bed, somewhere near 2 in the morning, candle pinched out, the last servant's footsteps fading down the hall, and you simply know, that in 4 or 5 hours the whole performance starts again. No sick days, no quiet Sunday. The king's mood does not pause for your exhaustion. There's a small dry irony folded into all of this, and it's the kind of thing that makes you almost smile in the dark. The entire point of being a royal mistress, the entire reason for your existence at court, was to provide rest and amusement for someone else. And in doing so, you got none of your own. Somebody really should have written that down on a plaque somewhere at Versailles. Here lived the woman whose whole job was relaxation, and who never once got to relax. Let's slow down and feel the texture of an ordinary evening. Picture the long gallery, mirrors catching candlelight and throwing it back 100 times over, so that even a modest number of flames feels like daylight. Heels on parquet. The soft creak of silk as someone curtsies a little too low, a little too pointedly, just to remind you that not everyone in the room is on your side. Somewhere a fan opens with a small papery snap. That's a sound that meant something. Back then, a whole private language of flirtation and insult folded into how a woman held her fan. You had to know it instantly, fluently, the way you'd know your own name. And underneath all of it, you had to seem happy. Not just composed, happy, effortlessly so. Cheerfulness, whether or not it was genuine, was treated as a basic requirement of politeness at court, on the same level as knowing how to walk correctly or hold your cutlery. Imagine carrying that every day for years. A smile as a uniform you were never permitted to take off, even in private, because you never quite knew who was watching, or through which keyhole. There's something almost unbearably ordinary about the cost of all this, when you look closely. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody locked Madame de Pompadour in a tower. Nobody starved her. The damage was quieter than that, and slower and in some ways worse for being so unremarkable. She suffered frequent, severe migraines, bad enough, more than once, that she had to step away from performances in her own private theater, and on at least one occasion it took her well over a month to feel fully herself again. By her later years she was contending with chronic migraines, lung trouble, and a body that had simply been asked to do too much, for too long, with too little rest. Her friends noticed. One friend, writing to her in 1760, asked, half joking, what exactly the Marquise did with her days when she wasn't either suffering through a migraine or trapped in tedious company, which tells you something about how often those two things were simply the whole of her week. You start to understand, hearing details like that, why so many royal mistresses look, in their portraits, just slightly tired around the eyes, however carefully the painter has tried to flatter them. Stillness was a costume too. You had to look serene while your stomach was doing something closer to drowning. Let's walk through the architecture of an entertainment, because it tells you so much about the actual labor involved. If the king was sliding toward one of his low gray moods, and by most accounts this happened often, it fell to you, and only you, to fix it. A private staircase connected your rooms directly to his, built so he could come and go from your apartments without anyone in the wider palace seeing him do it. That's intimacy, yes. But it's also a kind of permanent on-call status. A door that's always unlocked is a door you can never fully relax behind. You arranged the private theatricals. You planned the suppers, chose the music, picked the guests carefully enough to keep the conversation sparkling, but never so sharp it might offend. You organized the trips out to the smaller country houses, because variety itself was part of the cure for royal boredom, and royal boredom was, in its own quiet way, dangerous to you. A bored king looks elsewhere. A bored king remembers that mistresses are, in the end, replaceable. It's a strange kind of power, when you think about it slowly enough. You had real influence, genuine, documented, historically significant influence, in Pompadour's case, over architecture, over porcelain, over which ministers kept their jobs, and yet none of it sat on solid ground. All of it rested on your ability to keep one particular man entertained, indefinitely, without ever once looking tired while you did it. Even your beauty routines fed back into this exhausting machinery. Picture the hours spent on hair alone, powdered, curled, built up into shapes that needed careful, painstaking maintenance, redone again and again, because nothing about court fashion was designed for convenience. There's a small, gentle joke buried in most fashion history, and it's this one. The more elaborate the hairstyle, the less anyone considered whether the woman wearing it could actually move her neck comfortably, or sleep on it, or simply exist inside it for 12 straight hours without a single complaint. Beauty in this world was a kind of architecture you had to live inside. And here's the quiet, sad irony sitting underneath the whole chapter. The harder you worked at being delightful, restful, endlessly soothing company, the more invisible the actual cost of that work became, even to the people who loved you. More than one person at court, friend and rival alike, said outright that she had sacrificed her health for her position, and still the work didn't stop. Still the candles burned late. Still the carriage wheels turned on the gravel outside, carrying her off to one more supper, one more performance, one more night of being wonderful for somebody else. If you ever find yourself imagining the life of a royal mistress and picturing only the jewels, the silk, the soft candlelight catching on a diamond, try, just for a moment, to picture the exhaustion sitting just behind her eyes instead. The ache in her feet after hours of standing perfectly straight. The headache she's not allowed to mention. The yawn she swallows behind a closed fan. There was also, quietly, the matter of money, and not in the way you might expect. People imagine a royal mistress simply receiving gifts, simply spending. The truth is heavier than that. Over the years, Pompadour held something like 15 separate residences with the king, and every single one of them needed constant refurnishing, redecorating, restocking with art and furniture and fresh upholstery, because nothing at this level of court life was ever allowed to look settled or finished. She didn't just enjoy beautiful rooms. She was, in effect, running a small empire of households, full-time, on top of everything else. She poured real effort into building things that would outlast her. A porcelain works at a town called Sèvres, bought outright and turned into one of the most celebrated manufactories in Europe, providing steady, skilled work for the people of the region. It's easy to read that today as elegant patronage. It's worth remembering it was also, in part, strategy. Beautiful objects, signed with her taste, scattered across the homes of the powerful, were a quiet, ongoing reminder of exactly how indispensable she had made herself. Even her hobbies were, in some sense, still the job. And here's a detail that tells you everything about how thin the ice really was, no matter how secure she looked from the outside. Despite holding the king's affection for nearly 20 years, despite the porcelain, the patronage, the private staircase, the influence over which ministers kept their posts, Pompadour had been born a commoner, daughter of a man who worked in army supply. That single fact never stopped mattering, not for one single day. When she finally died, worn through by illness at just 42, court protocol forbade the king from attending her funeral at all. Not because he didn't grieve, by every account he did, but because, in the eyes of the system she had spent 2 decades mastering, she was still, underneath the titles and the porcelain, not quite the right rank to be properly mourned by him in public. Sit with that for a moment, gently, the way you'd sit with any sad, quiet fact before sleep. 20 years of being indispensable. 20 years of headaches swallowed and smiles held in place. And at the very end, the rules that had shaped her entire working life were still there, waiting to remind her, one final time, exactly where she stood, tired, beautiful, indispensable, and, underneath all three, almost entirely alone with it, still working, even in her sleep, in a way, still smiling, even when no one demanded it anymore, because the habit had worn itself so deep into her that she couldn't easily set it down, still hers to carry, that particular, glittering, unpaid exhaustion, long after the candles guttered out, and the long gallery finally, mercifully, went dark. Imagine, for a moment, that everything you have, your house, your servants, your children's names, your entire place in the world, exists because one man likes you, not because of a contract, not because of a law, just because, for now, he likes you. That was the actual legal reality, underneath every royal mistress's silk and jewels. There was no office for the position, no salary written into any treasury ledger that couldn't simply be crossed out. The whole arrangement rested on affection, and affection, as anyone who has ever loved someone knows, is a famously unstable foundation to build a life on. Let's cross the channel for this part of the story, over to England, to the court of King Charles II, a king so fond of mistresses that historians still aren't entirely sure how many he had. Picture his court like a small, glittering, slightly chaotic household, several women's circling the same man at once, each of them building a life with no more solid ground beneath it than his continued attention. Here is where the precariousness becomes almost painfully concrete. When a king's mistress had a child, that child was, by the strict letter of the law, nobody, no surname, no title, no claim to anything at all, unless the king personally, formally, chose to grant one. Imagine carrying a baby for 9 months, going through labor in a curtained chamber, with the midwife's basin and the smell of vinegar and herbs in the air, and then handing that child to a world that legally does not recognize his existence as anyone's son at all. Nell Gwyn understood this with brutal clarity. Nell wasn't born into nobility, quite the opposite. Her mother is believed to have kept a brothel in Covent Garden, and Nell herself sold oranges in a London theatre before her wit and comic timing carried her onto the stage and, eventually, into the king's notice. Unlike some of the king's other favorites, Nell had no powerful family standing behind her, ready to fight her corner if the king's affections wandered. So when her son's half-brothers, children of other mistresses from grander families, began receiving noble titles one by one, and her own boy still had none, Nell did something almost shockingly direct. The story goes that when the king visited her home, she called out to her young son in front of him, "Come here, you little bastard, and say hello to your father." When Charles, startled, scolded her for using that word about his own child, Nell reportedly answered that he hadn't given her any other name to call him by. It's a sharp little story, and it's worth pausing on, because underneath the wit there's something genuinely uncomfortable. A mother, forced to publicly humiliate her own child, and herself, simply to win him a legal identity. Soon after, her son did receive his title, eventually becoming a duke. But think about what it took to get there. Not paperwork, not precedent. A calculated, public, slightly desperate piece of theater, performed by a woman who understood that nothing would be given to her or her children automatically. Everything had to be won, on the spot, through charm, wit, or sheer nerve. Contrast that gently with Barbara Palmer, later Duchess of Cleveland, another of Charles's long-term mistresses, but one born into a far grander family. All 5 of Barbara's children with the king were formally acknowledged and eventually ennobled. Her eldest son was even given a special legal arrangement, allowing a dukedom to pass to him, despite his illegitimate birth, a workaround that wealthy, well-connected families could sometimes negotiate, but that simply wasn't available to everyone. 2 women, both mistresses to the same king, both bearing his children, and one of them needed a public stunt with a toddler dangled half out a window, in some versions of the story, just to get the bare minimum that the other received, as a matter of course. That's the quiet cruelty hidden inside this whole arrangement. It wasn't just about whether the king loved you. It was about whether you had family, money, and connections standing behind you before you ever arrived at court. Because all of that determined how securely your children, your only real legacy, would be allowed to exist in the eyes of the law. And even security wasn't really security. Listen to what happened at the very end of Nell Gwyn's story. As King Charles lay dying, with his brother James waiting to inherit the throne, one of his last requests, repeated by witnesses for generations afterward, was a simple, almost offhand line to his brother: "Don't let poor Nellie starve." Sit with that phrase for a second. 20 years at the king's side, 2 sons, a public life built entirely around him. And his dying wish for her wasn't security. It was simply that she not starve. That was the ceiling. Not flourish, not inherit, just survive. To his credit, James did keep that promise, paying off her debts and granting her a pension. But notice what that tells you about the whole system. Her entire financial future, after 2 decades of devoted service to the crown, depended entirely on whether the next king, a man under no legal obligation to her whatsoever, happened to feel like honoring a dying brother's casual request. There was no pension fund, no widow's allowance written into any law. Just the goodwill of whoever held the throne next, and goodwill, as we've already gently established, is not exactly load-bearing. Even daily court life reinforced how conditional everything was. A mistress's apartments, however grand, were not technically hers. They belonged to the crown, granted for as long as favor lasted and not 1 day longer. Her servants answered, ultimately, to the same crown. Her pension, her jewels, her houses, all of it existed in a kind of permanent loan, revocable the moment the king's attention drifted, or the moment the king himself drew his last breath. There's a small, dry observation worth making here, the kind that might make you huff out a quiet laugh in the dark, even as the sadness of it settles in. We tend to imagine royal mistresses as women who had, in some sense, won, beaten the system, climbed higher than birth should have allowed. And in a narrow sense, some of them genuinely had. But it's worth noticing how much of that winning depended on staying perpetually, exhaustingly likable, charming, indispensable. Because the moment any of that faltered, there was no safety net of law or institution to catch you. Just a king's memory, and a king's mood, and whatever family connections you'd managed to build up on the side, just in case. Picture, one more time, the contrast between 2 nurseries in the same era, one where a child's name and title arrived smoothly, almost as a formality, because the mother's family had the right connections, another where the mother had to perform a small, humiliating piece of street theater in front of the king himself, just to get her son the same basic dignity. Both children, in the end, became dukes. But only one mother had to fight, publicly, humiliatingly, for it. It's easy, centuries later, to read these stories and smile at Nell Gwyn's quick wit, her sharp tongue, her refusal to be cowed. She really was remarkable that way. Funny, fearless, beloved by ordinary Londoners in a way few royal mistresses ever managed. But underneath the wit was a woman doing the relentless, exhausting work of building, from nothing but charm and nerve, a legal safety net that other women were simply handed at birth, no place of your own, no name guaranteed for your children unless you fought for it, sometimes loudly, sometimes publicly, sometimes at your own expense. No retirement plan beyond a king's casual dying request to his brother, just affection, held up against the wind for as long as it could last, precarious even at its most glittering, provisional even at its most secure, hers, and never quite hers, all at once. Imagine never once being alone, not in the bath, not while you sleep, not while you cry, if you're foolish enough to do it somewhere other than behind a firmly locked door. A royal court was in many ways an enormous, slow-moving audience, and you were always, always on stage. Even your most private moments had witnesses, a lady's maid folding linen in the corner, a page waiting by the door, a curious face glimpsed for half a second through a gap in a curtain. Privacy, as we understand it now, simply didn't exist for a woman in your position. Every gesture was material for gossip. Every outfit was a message, decoded and redecoded by dozens of watchful eyes before you'd even crossed the room. Let's settle into the story of a woman who knew this particular pressure better than almost anyone. Jeanne Bécu, who the world would come to know as Madame du Barry, the last great mistress of King Louis XV of France. Picture her background first, because it matters enormously to what came next. She was born the illegitimate daughter of a seamstress, with no confirmed father, raised partly in a convent, working various small jobs around Paris, before her striking beauty drew the attention of powerful, well-connected men. By the time she caught the king's eye, she had lived a life about as far from noble birth as it was possible to get at Versailles, and the court never, ever let her forget it. To even hold the official position of royal mistress, etiquette required her to be married to a titled nobleman. So a hurried wedding was arranged to a count's brother, complete with a falsified birth certificate, quietly shaving a few years off her age and smudging over her humble origins. Imagine that for a moment, needing a forged piece of paper just to be considered acceptable enough to stand in a room you'd already, in every practical sense, earned your place in. It didn't work, not really. Imagine walking into the most beautiful, most carefully decorated room you have ever seen, every surface gilded, every face powdered to porcelain smoothness, and knowing, the instant you enter, that half the people in it have already decided you don't belong. That was Madame du Barry's daily reality at Versailles. Her beauty was undeniable. Her position was, officially, the highest a woman outside the royal family could hold. And still, doubts about her background followed her into every single room, whispered behind fans, dressed up as polite conversation but landing exactly like the insult it was meant to be. The young Dauphine, the future Queen Marie Antoinette, then still a teenager newly arrived from Austria, refused for a long stretch of time to speak to her at all. Not out of personal cruelty exactly, but because acknowledging Madame du Barry meant acknowledging a woman whose rise the old aristocratic order found genuinely scandalous. Picture the particular, specific loneliness of that, being the second most powerful woman at the most glittering court in Europe and still being treated, by the future queen herself, as someone unworthy of basic conversation. Years went by before they exchanged so much as a sentence. Here's where the dry, gentle humor creeps in, the kind that's almost more sad than funny once you sit with it. The entire elaborate machinery of court etiquette, the bowing, the precise order of who entered a room first, who one was permitted to speak to, and in what tone, existed, in large part, to protect a hierarchy that a king's own romantic choices kept quietly undermining. The aristocracy built an exhausting, intricate set of rules specifically so they wouldn't have to treat a seamstress's daughter as an equal. And then the king went and made her the most powerful woman in France anyway, leaving everyone else to seethe behind their fans about it for years. Now widen the lens a little, because this wasn't only Madame du Barry's burden. This was the general condition of being watched at this level of society. A royal mistress's body itself became public property, in a sense. Endlessly painted, endlessly described, endlessly compared. Was she more beautiful than the last one? Was she aging well? Was her waist still narrow, her skin still smooth, her hair still thick? These weren't private anxieties. They were openly discussed, dissected over dinner by people who had never spoken a single word to her directly. Imagine carrying that knowledge into every room you entered, knowing that your face, right now, in this exact lighting, at this exact angle, was being silently graded by dozens of people simultaneously. Imagine knowing that a single bad night's sleep, a single faint shadow under your eyes, might become a topic of quiet, cutting conversation by the time the candles were lit for supper. And unlike almost anyone else at court, you couldn't simply withdraw from the game when it became too much, because withdrawing was, in itself, a kind of danger. Step back from public view for too long, and rumors would start. That you were ill, that you were out of favor, that someone new had quietly taken your place in the king's affections. So you stayed visible, you stayed composed, you stayed gently, gracefully, endlessly on display, whether you felt like it or not. And the costume required for all that endless visibility was, frankly, absurd if you stopped to actually think about it. Wide skirts held out by stiff underframes so enormous that women sometimes had to turn sideways simply to pass through an ordinary doorway. Stays laced tight enough to shape the whole torso into a fashionable silhouette, regardless of whether that silhouette left enough room underneath for a truly satisfying breath. Towering powdered hairstyles that took hours to construct and could not, under any circumstances, be slept on properly, which meant inventing whole new sleeping arrangements. Special headrests, careful positioning, just to protect a hairstyle from a single night's rest. It is genuinely difficult to imagine a system better designed to make a woman simultaneously magnificent to look at and thoroughly miserable to actually be. Somewhere, surely, a royal mistress sat very still in an enormous gown, unable to draw a full breath, hair pinned into architecture, smiling serenely for a portrait, and thought some version of, "Whoever designed this, I hope they had to wear it too." There's something worth noticing in Diane de Poitiers' story here too, because her situation reveals just how long-lasting this pressure could be. She held her position as Henry II's great love and closest companion for around 25 years, an extraordinarily long run by the standards of the time, and she did it while being, by court gossip's careful arithmetic, nearly 20 years older than the king himself. Picture the particular exhaustion of that. Not simply being watched and judged in the present moment, but being watched and judged against the slow, inevitable arithmetic of time itself, year after year after year, in a court where everyone could do the math. And she did it brilliantly, by every account, staying composed, influential, beautifully turned out, decade after decade, in the signature black and white she wore as a permanent widow's mourning, long after most people had stopped remarking on it. But brilliance in this context simply meant successfully maintaining an exhausting performance for longer than anyone expected her to. The reward for doing it well wasn't rest. It was simply more years of being expected to keep doing it. Let's sit for a moment with the specific cruelty of court gossip as entertainment, because that's really what a great deal of it was. Entertainment for people with very little else to occupy their days. Diarists of the era kept detailed, often unkind records of royal mistresses, weighing their tempers, their spending, their supposed influence over the king, often without a shred of sympathy for the actual woman underneath all that scrutiny. One mistress of the English court, the fiercely extravagant and famously short-tempered Barbara Palmer, was nicknamed by one prominent diarist of the day as nothing less than the curse of the nation, a phrase that followed her, quoted and requoted, long after the diary entry itself was written. Imagine being permanently filed away in someone else's private journal as a curse, simply for living loudly and unapologetically in a position designed, structurally, to invite exactly that kind of judgment. It's a strange, specific kind of loneliness, being constantly observed and rarely actually seen. Hundreds of eyes on you at any given moment, and almost none of them looking at the tired, ordinary woman underneath the powder and the silk. Just the role. Just the performance. Just the verdict, rendered fresh, every single day, by an audience that never went home. If you ever picture a royal mistress sweeping into a glittering ballroom, take a quiet second to also picture the version of that walk that never made it into any painting. The small, private breath taken just outside the door first. The brief, practiced arrangement of the face into something serene. The walk in, steady and graceful, while somewhere underneath all that composure, a whole private weather system of nerves and fatigue and quiet dread keeps turning, invisible to absolutely everyone in the room. Watched, always. Judged, constantly. And in the middle of all those eyes, so often, so quietly, unbearably alone, imagine a room you have lived in for 25 years. Every cushion chosen by you, every painting hung at your direction, the crown jewels themselves, on loan to your own hands, resting in a box on your own dressing table, as if they had always belonged there. Now imagine being given a single afternoon to leave it all behind. This is the part of the story almost nobody wants to dwell on, because it isn't elegant, and it doesn't photograph well, and it doesn't fit easily into a painting full of silk and candlelight. But it's the truest part of the whole arrangement, the part that explains, more than anything else we've talked about so far, exactly why this glittering position was never quite what it appeared to be from the outside. Everything, the houses, the jewels, the influence, the entire architecture of your daily life, was on loan. And loans eventually come due. Let's return to Diane de Poitiers, the woman who spent a quarter of a century as the most powerful woman in France, more influential by far than the actual queen. For 25 years, King Henry II adored her, trusted her, signed his official letters with both their names entwined into one. She had outlasted rivals, outlasted gossip, outlasted the passage of decades that should, by every normal court calculation, have weakened her position. She seemed, by any reasonable measure, secure. Then, on an ordinary summer day in 1559, during a jousting tournament held to celebrate a royal wedding, a splintered lance struck the king in the eye. He lingered for 10 days, and in those 10 days, everything Diane had built quietly, carefully, over 25 years came apart, at a speed that must have felt almost impossible. Queen Catherine de' Medici, who had spent decades watching her husband love another woman more openly than he had ever loved her, finally had the power to act, and she used it immediately. She refused to let Diane anywhere near the dying king's bedside, even as he reportedly called for her. Imagine that particular cruelty, the man you have loved for 25 years, dying just down the hall, and a closed door between you that you no longer have any power to open. The moment Henry drew his last breath, the dismantling began. Diane was ordered to return the crown jewels, every single piece, to the new queen. She was made to surrender the beautiful Chateau de Chenonceau, the one Henry had given her specifically because Catherine had wanted it for herself, and was handed a far less desirable property in its place, almost as a parting insult dressed up as a transaction. And then, simply, she was sent away, banished, in practice, if not always in name, from the court that had been the entire center of her world for a quarter of a century. She was around 60 years old when it happened. 60, and suddenly required to rebuild an entire identity from nothing in a single season, after spending the whole of her adult life as the second most powerful person in France. She retired to her own estate and lived quietly there for her remaining years, which, to be fair, is a gentler ending than many mistresses received. But picture the particular, specific grief of it anyway. Not just losing a man you loved, but losing, in the very same week, every single external sign that your life had ever mattered, as much as it once so clearly did. There's a dry, sad little irony tucked into this story too, if you look closely. Diane had spent decades carefully managing the king's marriage on Catherine's behalf, encouraging him toward his wife's bedroom during the early, childless years, nursing Catherine back to health during a dangerous illness, even helping educate the royal children. In some strange way, Diane had spent years quietly protecting the very woman who would, the instant she gained the power to do so, erase her almost entirely. Kindness, in this particular court, bought no insurance at all. Now let's walk forward in time, back to Madame du Barry, the woman we spent a whole earlier chapter watching endure the court's quiet, constant judgment. Her story doesn't end with a graceful retirement to a country estate. It ends somewhere much darker, somewhere this gentle bedtime story can only approach softly, the way you'd approach any sad true thing before sleep. Acknowledged, but never dwelt on with anything sharp or frightening. After King Louis XV died, the new king and queen, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the very Dauphine, who had once refused to speak to her, sent Madame du Barry away from court entirely to live for a time inside convent walls. Eventually she was permitted to retire instead to her own estate, where she lived for years afterward in comfort, continuing her old habits of patronage and generosity, seemingly believing, as so many former mistresses must have, that the worst chapter of her story was already behind her. It wasn't. The French Revolution arrived, and with it, an entirely new and far more dangerous kind of court scrutiny. Not gossip now, but suspicion of treason. Madame du Barry, once denounced by a former member of her own household, was accused of secretly helping nobles flee the country, arrested, and brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. In December of 1793, she was executed by guillotine in Paris, reportedly pleading with her executioner, again and again, for just one more moment. We won't dwell on the details of that morning longer than this. It's enough, gently, to know that it happened, that a woman who had once been the most powerful figure at the most dazzling court in Europe ended her life frightened, alone, begging for time that nobody granted her. It's a stark, sobering reminder that even decades after a mistress's position had formally ended, even after retirement, even after seeming safety, the precariousness that defined the whole institution could still, eventually, catch up. Most royal mistresses, thankfully, met gentler endings than that. Many retired quietly to convents or country estates once their time at court had passed, trading the glittering uncertainty of royal favor for the calmer, more predictable uncertainty of ordinary life. Some found a kind of peace in that trade. Many French mistresses across the centuries, faced with the sudden loss of royal protection, chose convent walls almost as a default, not always out of faith, but because a convent was one of the very few places in this world built specifically to take in women who no longer had anywhere else that was reliably, permanently theirs. There's something worth sitting with in that pattern, something quietly telling about the whole institution we've spent this entire evening exploring. A position built from the very start on being endlessly wanted, and an ending, so often, built on no longer being wanted at all. The same court that had once watched every gesture, judged every gown, weighed every flicker of the king's attention toward you, simply turned its eyes elsewhere. The moment you stopped being useful to its endless appetite for spectacle, no pension guaranteed by law, no title that couldn't be quietly stripped away, no home that wasn't, in the end, on loan. Just years, sometimes wonderful years, full of real influence and real tenderness and real laughter, built on ground that everyone involved secretly knew could shift beneath you at any moment, with no warning at all. And maybe that's the truest answer to tonight's question. Why did being a royal mistress actually, quietly, persistently suck underneath all the diamonds and the porcelain and the candlelit galleries? Because the entire shining structure of it, the houses, the titles, the influence, even the love, rested on a foundation that was never, not once, legally, permanently yours. Beautiful while it lasted, precarious the whole time, and in the end so very often gone, now, quiet and gone, and somehow still remembered, centuries later, by us tonight in the soft dark, thinking gently of women who were never quite as safe as their portraits made them look. So that's tonight's story, friends. Candles and silk and porcelain, and underneath all of it, so many tired women, holding themselves together for rooms full of people who rarely, if ever, looked closely enough to notice. You don't have to remember any of the names. You don't have to remember the dates, or the titles, or which chateau belonged to whom. Just let the feeling of it settle instead. The slow hush of a palace at the very end of a long night, candles burning low, one last fountain still running quietly somewhere out in the dark. Your own room is so much simpler than any of theirs. No watching eyes here, no fan held just so, no performance left to give tonight. Just you, warm, still, settling further into the blankets with every breath. Let your shoulders drop, just a little more than they already have. Let your hands go soft and heavy where they rest. Somewhere far away, in a story finished long, long ago, the last candle in a long mirrored gallery is finally, gently going out. And here now, so are you, quite soft, drifting sove and warm and entirely, finally, your own good night.